Beginnings are always difficult.
Yes, Baron.
If Casanova suddenly turned out to be Romeo, having supper with Juliet, who might become Cleopatra, how would you start?
I would start with cocktails.
Mm-hmm.
This is How Would Lubitsch Do It, a podcast in which we discuss the works of director Ernst Lubitsch one film at a time. Or, at least, starting in our next episode. For our series premiere, I've convinced someone far more qualified than myself to discuss modern German history so we might contextualize Lubitsch's early career. Our conversation starts with Napoleon, encompasses the whole of the 19th century, the Great War, through to the Weimar era and beyond. I hope that you'll enjoy it as much as I did. Come visit ernstcast.com if you'd like show notes, resources as to where you might find these highly obscure movies we'll be discussing, or just to say hi. Welcome. We are here with Lauren Faulkner Rossi, an assistant professor in the Department of History at Simon Fraser University. Can you let us know a little bit about yourself and what you specialize in?
Sure. At SFU, I teach courses on the two world wars, on comparative genocide, and on Holocaust studies, but my research interests are primarily in modern Germany, so 1871 to the present, and primarily cultural and social history. So politics and the wars and military stuff is great, but my research interests are, actually my first book was about the role of religion and faith and the justifications that priests came up with for having to serve in the military during World War II.
Well, thank you so much for making the time to be here with us on
thanks for having me.
On our extremely niche film podcast. So we are not going to talk about Ernst Lubitsch much, if at all, today. What I would like to do is to give me and you, the listener, hello, waving to you, a little bit of a grounding in the place and time that Ernst Lubitsch grew his roots as an artist. Of course, he was born in 1892 and joined Max Reinhardt's theater company in his 20s, which would have been the early 1910s. He started his directing career in 1915-16 before eventually leaving Germany for reasons of Hollywood came calling, as David Collette would say. So we want to rewind a little bit beyond that 1892 date. And to start, I'd like to quote Richard Evans with the question that opens his book, The Coming of the Third Reich, which is it okay to start with Bismarck?
So my answer to that is I've never started with Bismarck. When I teach German history, I think even if you're just teaching modern German history, which tends to be defined as beginning with the inception of the nation state, the unification of Germany, which is Bismarck in 1871, you can't understand how that happened if you don't go back to what was there before. And maybe that's a problem that plagues all historians. How do you decide where to start? Because there's always something that came before. But I think for me, I would actually quote a different German historian, Thomas Nipperdey, who famously began his history with, in the beginning of Germany was Napoleon. So I would go all the way back to Napoleon because it was really the arrival of Napoleon's armies in Central Europe before there was a Germany. So German-speaking lands, but dozens of independent kingdoms and duchies and principalities. It was the arrival of the French armies that really instigated a sense of German nationalism that spread throughout this area. And then it took another seven decades for the right circumstances to come about to allow Germany to unify as what we know today as Germany. And it was Bismarck who oversaw that through force of personality or happy circumstance for him. But it took 7 decades about. So when I say to my students, Germany started in 1871, but really it sort of cooked for several decades before that. And it had a lot to do with non-German actors that came in and sort of lit fires underneath them, so to speak.
And how did the failed revolution of 1848 play into that? It's often called, I've seen this reference in numerous places, the idea in air quotes, listeners, Germany reached its turning point and quote unquote failed to turn.
Failed to turn, yes. Yeah. That always makes me laugh. And it's, as a graduate student, that's what I was taught. And then I was sort of taught that such a categorization is rooted in a sort of implicit understanding that the British and French models were the quote unquote right models that Germany failed to emulate. So the failure refers to German liberalism. And 1848 meant that the revolutionaries, really, who were liberal politically and nationalists dedicated to the realization of an independent, united Germany, they failed to somehow garner broad enough support for the evolution of a nation state along liberal lines. And that this somehow doomed German liberalism, because what eventually happened with Bismarck, who was not at all a liberal, he was quite fiercely locked into different kinds of confrontation with them for most of his political career. He is the one who oversaw the unification of Germany, and therefore it was not along liberal lines. So that quotation refers to a certain understanding of the evolution of the German nation state, which failed to become liberal along the French or British examples. So what did 1848 have to do with unification? Well, it had a great deal to do with it, because it meant the liberals were not really in charge of it, or were not overseeing it. It meant that liberals who didn't abandon their ideals had to work with other interests and other groups who weren't necessarily interested in realizing a Germany that would look and act the same way. And it meant that conservative forces, spearheaded by Bismarck, but also by different leaders in different areas of the German-speaking lands of Central Europe, also had a great deal of political power, particularly the Prussian king, who ends up becoming German emperor with Bismarck as chancellor.
And who is that?
I have to think about this. William I. The Hohenzollern dynasty, which was the leading house of the Kingdom of Prussia, had three names that they recycled: Frederick, William, and Frederick William. And so William I, King of Prussia, then became William I, Emperor of Germany in 1871. And it was as a result of the Kingdom of Prussia winning a series of wars with neighboring countries. And this is where the sort of the might and honor and prestige of the Prussian army becomes the backbone of a German military that is also widely respected and honored outside of Germany because of these military victories. It also means that the German nation state that was realized in 1871 was born of war and violence. And Bismarck was sort of essential in this. He was a conservative East Prussian aristocrat who insisted in 1871, after the Third War with France, Germany's age-old enemy. This was the reversal of Napoleon's victories 7 decades earlier, right? Insisted that he wasn't interested in war anymore, that he was satisfied, and that the German Empire, as it then was formed, was complete. He wouldn't keep gobbling up neighboring countries. He did take chunks of France, Alsace and Lorraine. He did take a chunk of Denmark after that first war with Denmark. And he sidelined Austria completely. The middle war was with Austria. And it was the defeat, actually, of Austria that maybe didn't precipitate, but it continued the downward spiral of the Austrian Empire, which in 1815 had been the authority on the continent. And it solidified Prussia's place as the dominant power in Central Europe, and therefore the dominant power in a united Germany.
To kind of look forward to what was to come in the 20th century, there's often this common, I'd say, belief that Germany was uniquely situated to fall into this kind of abyss of violence that happened, that occurred with the, in 1933, and this almost fatalistic attitude towards that, right? That somehow Germany, of all countries, had a unique set of ingredients.
I warn my students against that because as a historian, I have to say there's nothing inevitable at any point in history. And second, that such an understanding of the evolution of German history is predicated on reading it backwards, really. You're starting in 33, or really you're starting in like 41 or 42, and you're looking backwards to find this pattern that if you start from the other end, so to speak, 1871 or earlier, 1892, whatever, and go forwards, there's actually nothing inevitable about 1933. And there were so many other points at which something else might have come about quite easily. And you could do the same with the histories of other nation states. It's just that Germany has such powerful and dark history. I think that they're the favorite to sort of play with history in this way. Nazism, fascism, Hitler, there's no glimmer at all of him at the end of the 19th, turn of the 20th century in Germany. While we might focus on the authoritarian political structure, the dominance of Prussia, the glory of the military and militarism, it had a constitution. It had a parliament that, while its powers were quite limited, it did have control over the budget. The emperor was not all powerful, certainly depended on the chancellor. Bismarck was not all powerful. He owed his position to the emperor. And while he got along very well with and was supported by the first emperor that he served, the first emperor of Germany, his successor, William II, couldn't stand him. And Bismarck didn't last very long. He was dismissed quite abruptly in 1890, right? So there are all these sort of, I wouldn't call them checks and balances, because that brings to mind the American system, and really there's not a lot of comparison there. But there are, you call them ingredients. There are elements to the German situation that I think are worth bearing in mind when we're tempted to sort of fast forward and see this as simply a staging ground for what comes later. Mm-hmm.
It almost reduces, I think, to me, the situation and achievements of, especially I think, Weimar Germany as almost a prelude to
absolutely
what people think is the main event, in giant air quotes, listeners.
Yeah. Historians have also tended to treat Weimar as a situation that was inevitably going to fail, and it had all sorts of problems that weren't really present prior to World War I. But again, it was a very different political structure, I would argue, that came about in 1919.
Leading us to the kind of direct pre-war era, I say the turn of the century. What sort of forces were at work in Germany, and Germans' attitudes leading up to that war? What expectations did Germans have there? But I also want to touch upon the sort of nature of the constitutional monarchy there, how that played into it, and the tensions there between the conservatives who, to my understanding, kind of held civil liberties in the social democrat sense in contempt.
Indeed.
Right? So how all that played into what occurred during the war and the myths that came out of that.
So there's a couple of different arenas that we have to sort of look at here. One is, of course, the relationship between Germany and its neighbors, and the evolution of that relationship between, say, the early 1870s and the first decade and a half of the 20th century. And the other is the domestic, the sort of internal political system within Germany. And they're connected, obviously, in lots of important and complicated ways. As I mentioned, Bismarck, once he had a unified German nation state with Prussia firmly in control of that nation state, tried to pacify worried neighbors and calm down this sort of European situation by insisting that he wasn't interested in expanding on European territory anymore, and instead went about using diplomacy to safeguard Germany's position on the continent, or to try and grow German influence in more subtle ways, not through conquest or war. And he called this Realpolitik, right? This emphasis on diplomacy. William II, who succeeded William I as emperor, had a very different approach to international politics. This was Weltpolitik. And he much more brazenly wanted to make Germany a dominant world power, not just a dominant European power. And this meant competing directly with what the world power was at that time, which was Britain and the British Empire. And so he was less patient with the sort of diplomatic approaches that Bismarck had favored. And he did his best, for example, to acquire overseas colonies in ways that Bismarck had not really been as interested in. He was less interested in maintaining some of the alliances that Bismarck had signed with former enemies, former opponents on the battlefield. Austria and Germany remained aligned. They shared a culture, they shared a language. Less interested in playing nice with France, which became a problem. Less interested in playing nice with Russia, which also eventually became a problem. Because once Germany stepped back from relations with those two powers, it left them free to look elsewhere for reassurance, especially military reassurance, and they looked to Britain. And so there's all these sort of game playing and shifting of alliances that happens really after 1890 that ultimately sort of ratcheted up the tension in Europe. And this is also a debate that historians have. To what extent is Germany primarily responsible for causing World War I, right? And depending on who you ask, you'll get a very different answer. Germany's insistence that it deserved to be a world power right next to Britain caused all sorts of problems because that upset a sort of very delicate balance of power. And because Britain really wasn't interested in making room for another power, right? So that's sort of outside of Germany's borders. Within German borders, the conservatives remain fairly entrenched. The system was set up to really benefit them. The liberals are still smarting really from 1848. They're trying to figure out sort of who they are and what they stand for. They splinter actually a bunch of times, which is also problematic if you're trying to accrue any kind of foothold in the political system and become strong enough to take on the conservatives. And then you have the socialists, and I love the German socialists because by the eve of World War I, they're the biggest socialist movement on the continent, easily. And they're often close to or the largest political party in the German parliament. But again, because of the way the system was constructed, they're unable to actually do anything with that clout. And so you have this movement that represents an increasingly broad swath of the German population that can't really do anything for them. And there's a curious tension in their identity between their socialist instincts and their German national identity that really comes out in 1914 when the war starts and they're expected to sort of get in line with everybody else and support the war effort. German socialists were very, I wouldn't say they're pacifist, but they were very anti-war and very anti-imperialism, both being blamed for like the evils of capitalism, right? But in 1914, they capitulate and they do get in line and they do support the war effort for at least the first half of the war, to the detriment of that movement itself, because then it splinters too, just like the liberals. Mm-hmm. So you see within Germany, there's all of these tensions that sort of mirror the external tensions, and it weakens those who might be interested in reforming the system, which clearly is not there to represent the rights of the average German. That's not what that constitution was. I like making my students read that constitution. They hate it. Nobody likes reading constitutions. They're really boring. The point of the exercise is to understand that not all constitutions were written with an eye to protecting the rights of citizens. This one, the 1871 Constitution, was very much about determining where power lay and the obligations that German citizens had towards the state. And then it did various other things, like it preserved autonomy for some of the more powerful, smaller kingdoms. Bavaria and Baden, for instance, got to retain their own army. They got to retain control over their rail system. They got to have their own postal service, like sort of really odd bits that we think, wow, that's a strange thing to sort of insert into a constitution. But that's actually how unification was achieved. That's how some of these not quite as powerful as Prussia kingdoms and duchies were persuaded to fall in line behind the Prussian king. It in turn suggests that German national identity might not be as deep or as securely anchored as we might think heading into World War I because of all these regional loyalties that persist that you can actually see in the Constitution itself.
It's interesting to me how that contrasts with the popular conception of German nationalism leading up to there, where it's as if, if we're going by today's dates, on the eve of World War I, Germany had only, what was the year when we can say Germany kind of constituted itself as a nation state?
1871.
So thinking of a nation being fervently nationalist when it's 43 years old is quite something.
For sure. For sure. As I said, Napoleon really got Germans thinking about what it was to be German, because suddenly there were French occupation soldiers everywhere. So I'm not arguing there is no such thing as German national identity by 1914. There was a sense of German national identity. I'm simply challenging the idea that all Germans everywhere in Germany knew what that identity was and or could agree on what that identity was. Even if we look just at language, right? We tend to refer to Central Europe pre-1871 as German-speaking lands, right? And they did all speak German, but they all spoke different dialects of German. And somebody speaking the Plattdeutsch of Hamburg would have had a really hard time understanding somebody perhaps speaking some rural dialect of Bavarian German. And if you've ever been to Germany, I can tell you, you can hear the difference, even if you don't understand the German. These are people that sound like they're not quite speaking the same language, even though they are. So those differences persist into 1914, and there were much stronger regional identifications in some ways than, the sort of state-imposed national holidays, for example. What did Sedan Day mean? Was it the same meaning in the Rhineland as it was in East Prussia? German nationalism, I think, was really something that took an external presence to fire up. And without that external presence, I would argue Germans sort of back away from it and fall into a more regional identity in ways that it maybe is hard for us as Canadians in 2022 to conceptualize.
Leading into World War I, and did the average German citizen or even member of the political class, did they expect to win?
Oh, absolutely. They expected to win. They won 3 wars previously, right? Against Austria, Denmark, and France. And they'd been underdogs each time. Mm-hmm. The Russian army, as far as anyone knew, was in shambles. They couldn't beat Japan, which, oh my God, that was a crisis. The Japanese came out of nowhere, really, to win that war in the early 20th century. And that precipitated a huge crisis in Russia. And everyone, not just the Germans, everyone, but the Germans were all told they'd be home by Christmas. This would be an easy war. With Austria on the same side, also fighting. And no one really had a good idea of just how brutally the Austrian military would perform. But there was this firm idea that this was going to be a short war, just like the last 3 wars, and that Germany would win handily.
For the German population and the political and military classes, what happens to surprise them or undercut their expectations?
So what happens really is on the Western Front. And there's no quick victory. All of a sudden, it's Christmas 1914, and there's no sign of a breakthrough for either side. You have the British and the French on the one side, and the Germans on the other. Then you get into 1915, and there's still no breakthrough. And then it's 1916, and there's still no breakthrough. And it's just this. It's almost a slow realization that this is going to be a slog, and that there's no understanding of how to get out of this. Diplomacy is unthinkable. We came here to win. We're not here to sit down at a table and talk about this. We're just going to see this through. And it takes 4.5 years to see it through. The experience on the Eastern Front for the Germans is very different. There's a clear victory by the end of 1914. And even if we're going to be really picky as military historians, by spring 1915. Germans are occupying large sections of sort of Western Russia, and there's not much fighting, although there's no treaty until early 1918. The second surprise, which is in many ways worse, is the nature of the war. What so many did not account for was the advances in technology between the 1870s and 1914, and their devastation, like their sort of real impact on bodies, like physically, when they're unleashed in a war environment. So the nature of the fighting, the sort of psychological trauma of that fighting for those who suffered it, and for those who have to take care of the soldiers who survive, who go home sometimes in pieces, sometimes physically, sometimes mentally. So the legacy of this war, its brutality, the idea that you could kill easily from a distance, that you could kill tens of thousands in a matter of days. This is a new kind of warfare that very, very few were prepared for, that most found, because there was no choice, they had to in some way adapt to it. And there appeared to be no end year after year Battles like the Somme, for instance, the significant battle of 1916. It was a 10-month battle over something like 5 miles of territory. It was a front that stretched from the Channel to Switzerland that featured very little movement and no definitive victory between the end of 1914 and the middle of 1918. And it's so hard to convey to people now in 2022 what that meant for soldiers, but also for the countries involved. Like, how do you make sense of this? How do you sell this war to your young men who are still getting called up because each year means you need fresh bodies? So what is the impact on Germans? It's horrific. It was bad for everybody who was part of this. The Austrians, the Turks, the French, the British. Germans were fighting on German and French soil, mostly French for most of the war. So the impact on combatants was one thing. If they survived, they often survived with serious wounds. And I'm not talking just about physically, I'm talking about mentally. It was called shell shock, but it was an era in which PTSD was unknown, and weakness among men was perceived to be due to the character of the man and not to the nature of the trauma. And so they were frequently treated as, you just have to shrug it off and get back out there. Can you imagine telling that to somebody today who has PTSD? But that was sort of standard treatment. The medical professions sort of figured this out on the fly, and really they didn't figure it out until after World War II. For civilians left back at home, the war was brutal in different ways, and especially in urban centers. So Germany really wasn't prepared in any way to fight a long war. Remember, I said that everyone was told it'd be done by Christmas. So there was no long-term planning in terms of sort of the industrial input into the war, in terms of food planning. And so for German civilians, particularly in urban areas, the overarching, the largest memory of the experience of the war, outside of having to deal with family members who were killed or missing or wounded, was a lack of food. By 1915, there were significant food shortages in different parts of Germany. There was a ration system that was introduced fairly quickly. The winter of 1916 was called the turnip winter because that was essentially the only crop that could be found in German markets. And so Germans ate turnips for breakfast, for lunch, for dinner, for weeks. And I can't fathom that. So if you were in a rural area, you were a little bit better off because you had access to whatever you could find in the fields or in the forest, whatever you could sort of catch or hunt or dig up on your own. In a city, you don't have that option, right? So some had the foresight to try and grow vegetables in courtyards or in small gardens next to their homes. Some had the foresight to acquire rabbits and chickens and keep those as food sources, but you can only make those last for so long, right? One of the other catastrophes that visited Germany was sort of an avoidable accident. And it was the idea put forward in early 1915 by German war planners that pigs were rivals for humans in terms of having to be fed. And if we got rid of our pigs, then we'd have all this meat. And so there was a great pig massacre in 1915 in which most of Germany's pigs were killed. And then there was a sudden glut of sort of pork on the market. But
I shouldn't laugh. That's horrible. But
it is horrible. Whether you're vegetarian or vegan or not, like that was my goodness. Can you imagine? But the real lack of foresight was not just that pigs maybe were competing with humans, were they really? Or that we needed the meat. What else do pigs provide that was pretty essential if you are in agriculture? They're the basis of fertilizer. So killing all of the pigs means you're going to inevitably run into a shortage of fertilizer because, of course, the other thing that's happened as a result of the war, German imports are non-existent. This was actually how Britain planned to get Germany to surrender, right? They recognized that Germany was heavily dependent on imports, especially of food and foodstuffs, and they set up a blockade. And that blockade, the Germans didn't pierce it all war. It was a very effective naval blockade. And so by 1918, especially in major urban centers and especially in the capital, we could look at Berlin as the example, The food shortages are so severe and have been so systemic, so long-term, that Berlin is more or less on the verge of civil war. It's crippled by strikes and demonstrations. Most of the civilians spend their time standing in lines for food. There's widespread discontent. The socialists are no longer entirely on board with the war effort, partly for this reason. There's actually a split in the ranks of the socialists in 1917, and we have the core of the later Communist Party starts to emerge. And there's whispers of revolution and unrest. And after February 1917, with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, those fears start to really ramp up in Germany, that the socialist movement in Germany, which, by the way, was the largest socialist movement on the continent in 1914, that could lead to something similar happening on German soil that could really undermine, if not destroy, the war effort itself. So if you're the military planners of Germany in 1917, you're really starting to worry about how this war is going to end for your country.
And then you have the actual the revolution that did happen from 1918 to 1919.
In many ways, predictable. The German military planners, who by this point were essentially dictators, Martin Kitchen has called them the silent dictatorship. Hindenburg, who was the formal head of the military, and his quartermaster, General Erich Ludendorff, who is probably really the brains of the two, they're running Germany. The emperor is still there, but he's essentially they've essentially accrued power. They're determining who's chancellor and what decisions the chancellor is going to make. And they've decided in 1918 to put everything into one last offensive on the Western Front to try and break the stalemate. And the first part, I guess you could call it, there are sort of 4 waves. The first one goes relatively well, but they spend all of their energy. And the other thing that happens is that the Americans arrive. The Americans don't get involved in the war until 1917, formally. Informally, they were helping out Britain. But American troops start to arrive on European soil in 1918, and Germany cannot hope to keep up with the arrival of men as fresh as the Americans. So really, the writing's on the wall by the summer of 1918. And German civilians who have half a brain can see it too. So the end is not far off in coming, and nonetheless, it seems shocking when it does come. I think most Germans were expecting an armistice, a truce of some kind, sort of like what happens in the East with the Russians, who finally formally pull out of the war once the revolution's broken out. In fact, the revolution was caused by the war, and sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with the Germans, which was hugely punitive and greatly benefited the Germans. So I think that they were expecting on the Western Front something similar, and that's not what happens.
What did happen?
The military leaders indicate to the political leadership that they've been running that it's time to sue for peace. And then they sort of conveniently exit stage left. And so the signing of the peace is left to the political leadership, who then bear the brunt of essentially what's a lost war. The British and French and Americans were going to win. If the war had continued, they were essentially just across German borders and would have invaded. So the armistice meant that there was no formal invasion, but it was very clear to the military that the Germans had lost. About the same time, there are 2 revolutions proclaimed in Berlin on the 9th of November, which the Germans refer to as Schicksalstag, the day of German destiny, because an awful lot of really important things happened on November 9th. The 2 revolutions proclaimed different republics. This is before, by the way, November 11th, which is the end of the war. So Berlin is in complete chaos. The republic that ultimately wins out is the one that's sort of given the blessing of who's left to deal with military affairs and who's coordinating the parliament. The rival republic was the Socialist Republic that was set up by the more radical socialists, who then go on to become communists. And Berlin essentially is a simmering civil war for the next several months, up to a year and a half, until the leaders of that sort of incipient communist party are actually killed in police custody.
And was that the 1919 kind of failed revolution attempt?
Yeah.
And that was kind of start of the schism between the Social Democrats and the Communists.
Yes, absolutely. There was no sort of going back to being friendly with each other after that. Mm-hmm. It got so bad that the politicians charged with writing the Constitution for the new republic, because the emperor had to abdicate. This was part of the republic being proclaimed and the armistice being figured out. The politicians charged with writing a new constitution for this new republic had to leave Berlin because the fighting was so bad. They feared for their lives. Where did they retreat to write the constitution? To the city of Weimar, which has an illustrious history in terms of culture and in terms of figures like Goethe. So there was real symbolism in choosing Weimar as the city to write this new constitution. And that's where the era that follows gets its name, and where the constitution gets its name. It's sometimes just called the 1919 Constitution, but most historians will refer to it as the Weimar Constitution because it was written in Weimar.
And that brings us to, I guess, the Weimar years.
Yes, finally.
So interwar Germany is, I think, of fascination to many, because I think it's this interesting best of times, worst of times dichotomy within the era. You know, it's both a cautionary tale of what happens when, you know, the word we might use now is polarization hits an extreme where society has no, I think, to paraphrase Weitz, it's a society that is seen as lacking a consensus for how to move forward.
Yes.
While simultaneously, it's seen as this almost golden era full of cultural accomplishments and achievements. And, you know, it's often seen as the birth, for example, modern ideas of LGBT identity and trans rights.
Yep.
That's what it's seen as. How do we reconcile those two things?
Sure.
Do we even want to?
I mean, they exist in tandem and in tension with each other. It's because of that lack of consensus politically, I think, that you get such startling developments in the arts and in society. You have such broad capacity to experiment in so many ways because there's no consensus on what the rules are. So I think that's the resolution, actually, that they belong next to each other, that they can't exist one without the other.
Let's quickly touch upon the circumstances that led to this situation, right? Because we're finally in the era of a republic, right? There's no monarch, technically.
I know. Well, he's around. I think he's in the Netherlands, if I recall.
In exile?
In exile.
Yeah.
Well, so you have the power vacuum, really, that's created by the absence of traditional leadership as Germans knew it. Mm-hmm. In its place, you have a republic and parliamentary democracy, not a constitutional monarchy. And so this is not to say that Germans had no experience with democracy. They certainly did. We call it a constitutional monarchy before 1918, but there were still elections. There's still political parties.
Technically, so is Canada.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So that's a really good analogy to draw. And so it's tempting to think of Germans as inexperienced with the practice of democracy in the Weimar era, and that somehow explains what eventually happens. But I don't think it explains anything. I think actually they knew how to vote. They knew what engaged politics was. By all accounts, Margaret Anderson has done a lot of research into this. They voted enthusiastically. They participated in democracy. And so what's changed instead is the nature of the political structure. The idea that political parties and politicians now were in charge, and there was no single figure who was going to be making all of the important decisions. So a move away from authoritarianism, if you will. Mm-hmm. And perhaps it was this that Germans had less experience with. And certainly German politicians had trouble finding consensus, there's that word again, about how to fill that power vacuum. And so the new structure still had a chancellor and had a president in place of a monarch. And the president was elected, but on sort of an off cycle. And so there was a different system of checks and balances. There was an article written into the new constitution that was meant to, that was very much a product of that chaos at the end of the war that we discussed, where it was felt that if civil war threatens, if revolution threatens to sort of undermine everything, there has to be a way for us to make decisions quickly without sort of committee, right? Without sort of sitting around a table to discuss it. And so that was written into Article 48 of the Constitution, which in a crisis situation gave the president the power to sort of get around a lot of the checks and balances that the Constitution otherwise had and make very quick decisions about how to deal with an emergency. So I'm bringing this up for important reasons later on. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, the parliament, the Reichstag, which is both the physical building where the parliament met, as well as the name that the parliament, the group of politicians had, the Reichstag during the Weimar Republic, the era of the Weimar Republic, was largely an exercise in how to figure out or how to sort out political power sharing for the first time. Because while it had existed prior to 1914, its power was largely over the budget, and that was it. And all of a sudden, there are decisions to be made about implementing the Constitution, what to do with the Treaty of Versailles, which we haven't even discussed yet, what to do with federal versus state level legislation and power sharing, and so on and so forth. And the Treaty of Versailles comes really quickly after the Weimar Constitution is written and accepted. And the Treaty of Versailles sort of casts a long shadow over the Weimar Republic. And I would argue that if anything made it more likely that this experiment that we call the Weimar Republic was going to fail, it was not so much the political structure that the Constitution helped put in place, it was the Treaty of Versailles.
But was it the kind of punitive nature of it maybe, or?
It was partly the punitive nature, although really the Germans should have expected this. And they could have looked at their own treatment of the Russians with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. If you put those two side by side, that Brest-Litovsk is as harsh as, if not harsher than, the Treaty of Versailles. So there was shock and dismay and consternation and real resentment over the Treaty of Versailles, over the terms that it had in it. It whittled down the army to 100,000 men. It completely abolished the Air Force. It stripped Germany of all of its overseas possessions, so no more overseas empire. And it carved huge chunks of German territory out of Germany proper. And it separated East Prussia, for instance, from the rest of Germany because of the construction of the so-called Polish corridor. By the way, Poland is reconstituted, right, for the first time in, I think, over 200 years, which meant that huge pieces of Prussia were taken away from Germany, which, formerly belonged to an independent Poland. So all of that was bad enough. Perhaps not surprising given the way that treaties tended to be written by victorious European powers. What really sort of stung, what Germans had a hard time accepting, was Clause 231, the so-called war guilt clause. Mm-hmm. And I tell my students that I blame the Allies as much as I blame the Germans for this part of history. What Article 231 did was it assigned responsibility for the war to Germany and its allies for causing the war. And it was meant to justify the reparations that were demanded. So a certain amount of money and a certain amount of goods that had to be paid, particularly to France, but to all of the Allied countries who had suffered. The Germans really resented the idea that they were primarily responsible for this war. But the translation of the clause was also problematic because Germans understood it to assign sole responsibility. And they really bridled at this. Like we were one of several people who made this war. It takes two to sort of tango, right? And the Allies were aware that there was this common sort of misconception of what that article was and didn't do anything to correct the misconception. The Austrians had a similar clause in their treaty. I don't think the Hungarians did. They had a sort of separate setup. But they were by no means the only central power, the only losing power that was made to accept responsibility for the war. So when you have the kind of deep resentment stirred up by this treaty that was forced upon the Germans in the aftermath of the war, a war that it wasn't clear to many Germans they'd actually lost because there'd been no invasion, a war that they're very quickly told by the end of 1918, even during the chaos that reigned over Berlin. I think it's Hindenburg makes mention of this. They're told that the carpet was pulled out from under them by the civilian leadership at home who had signed this armistice, even though, in fact, Hindenburg and Ludendorff had instructed them to. It's a recipe for disaster. Like it's this refusal, this obstinate refusal by a majority of the German population to accept this treaty is just going to fester long term. And the politicians that are in charge of the Weimar Republic are by and large not interested in trying to make them feel better about it because they hate it as much as the next German, right? So talk about an opportunity to really cultivate and enhance a sense of national identity, but it's grounded in this idea of victimhood, of misplaced blame. It's a very negative conception of identity, but it really sort of resonates with a lot of Germans who had horrible, miserable experiences of the war and now have horrible, miserable experiences of the post-war period.
It isn't just the politics within Germany and some sort of part of the, German national character. That's the,
right.
In big air quotes again. It's a certain set of geopolitical circumstances that in many ways pressed down upon, the German population at that time. And as you say, caused misplaced blame. We have those political forces, and throughout the Weimar era, you have no shortage of political violence. Kind of taking a little detour into the experience of someone, you say a particularly cosmopolitan person in Berlin during this era. What would they, especially someone in the arts, who might may or not be related to the subject of this podcast, what would that experience have been like?
So cosmopolitan Germany, really what you're talking about is Berlin. Mm-hmm. There's no city like Berlin. It cast itself as and tried to be and was understood to be a world city on the same level as Paris or London, even before World War I, in terms of its cosmopolitanness and its dedication to the arts and its fervor in trying to attract tourists, both from around Germany, but also from around the world. So what happens under Weimar? The experience of the war in Germany meant that, among other things, to support the war effort, everyone had to be pulled into line. Censorship was a very real thing. And it was very rigid and very top down. And it was particularly heavy felt in urban areas, obviously, and in the arts, where obviously freedom of expression was highly prized and much sought after. So with the institution of a fledgling republic, whose attention was often elsewhere, censorship was lifted completely. And there was this very real sense of sudden freedom. Literally where you couldn't tell where the edges were. And so Berliners took that and ran with it. It had always, as I said, because of its status as a world city pre-1914, it had always tended in this direction. And outside of Berlin, Germans sort of viewed their capital with, I think, depending on their background, obviously, but some degree of skepticism. Like this is not a good example of true upright German. Mm-hmm. There's all sorts of suspicious, sketchy things that happen in the capital city kind of thing. And to some extent, that attitude continues into the post-war, post-1918 period. But if you're an artist that's from anywhere in Europe, Berlin is probably the most exciting place to be, precisely because of the absence of regulation. So, for instance, the cabaret culture, which predates World War I, flourishes between 1918 and 1933. And by cabaret, I mean live music. I mean entertainment, live entertainment, singing and dancing, audience interaction with the performers on the stage. You have a very vibrant gay subculture, a very open one that you couldn't necessarily live out elsewhere in Germany, including in other urban areas that would have been very sort of obviously problematic. But in Berlin, anything went. It wasn't policed at all, even if officially homosexuality remained criminalized according to the Weimar Constitution, which carried over some of the 1871 Constitution. And so it had been a criminal offense, particularly for men, from 1871.
My understanding, that was relatively unenforced after the Weimar Republic was founded, you have films like Richard Oswald's Different from the Others, where you have a depiction of an actual homosexual relationship on screen.
Yes. Yeah, shocking and but exciting. And I think those are two words that really go together with Berlin. Like the visual culture that comes out of Berlin in this era, shocking and exciting, sort of go together a lot at this time. Sort of shock entertainment. It quickly became known really globally that Berlin was a good place to go for illicit. Whatever your hedonistic tendencies ran to, you could probably find it satisfied in Berlin between 1919 and 1933.
Did this have something to do, perhaps, as a whole, with the kind of popular, especially external attitude towards Weimar that persists to this day, that it was a uniquely decadent, culture, especially Weimar Berlin? Because that's something that, that was the first. Have you ever seen the show Babylon Berlin? That show is basically about how decadent that culture is. And I found it interesting because it obviously explicitly departs from reality in lots of ways. Yeah, it does. It does, absolutely. Even to an amateur like me, I'm like, oh, this isn't quite right. But it almost feeds into this, I think, to my understanding, something of a myth that it was this wildly decadent, like unsustainable society in big air quotes.
This is a post-war atmosphere. And so to some extent, in urban centers across Western Europe, there is this giddy relief and celebration that the war is finally over. And so it's not just happening in Berlin in that sense, that atmosphere that sort of catapults some of this effervescence and cultural and artistic celebration into the heights that it achieves. But Berlin is different from London and Paris in that, it's a city that's literally emerging from bloodshed in the streets and revolution and near civil war in some areas, actual civil war. And so the idea that there are no boundaries for the moment, maybe tomorrow there'll be boundaries, but today there are no boundaries. That's really specific, I think, to Berlin. Like you don't even find it in Hamburg or Munich or Nuremberg, some of these other larger urban centers in Germany. It's the capital. Like it's also the seat of government. So there's a sense that things are really going on here, and it's the head of the new German Republic. So really the focus not just of Europe but of our entire country. There's a lot of sort of importance and self-importance, but so too again because they were the nerve center during the war years, and those pressures are now absent. That willingness to experiment and to see how far we can get before we find pushback. It's not just happening, obviously, in the visual arts, although that's certainly the most exciting. You see women and like-minded reformers organizing around the issue of abortion, for example, which also was illegal according to the new constitution, remains illegal until we get into post-45 period. There was an amendment passed in 26 that allowed abortion in certain circumstances. Usually the life of the mother was gravely endangered, which was seen at that time as really progressive and cutting edge. Of course, we would see it as quite very, very small steps forward, right? And the reformers themselves were disappointed in 26 because it was so restrictive. But you also had the idea that the reason that abortion was so important was because women were increasingly out in public, in the workforce, having independent lives in ways that hadn't existed before the war. And that was largely because of the war. In the absence of men, women, especially young women, had been required to take jobs. And they weren't necessarily willing to give up that freedom and that financial security when the men returned in 1918. So there's a real earnest and fiery conversation happening basically throughout the Weimar Republic about gender roles. Not just with an eye to the gay subculture that I've mentioned and to trans rights and the ideas around same-sex couples, but also towards like what should a woman be expected to do? What should a man's sphere be? You had mentioned, I think before we got started, cross-dressing sort of it takes off, maybe is the wrong way to put it, because it implies it hadn't been around before, and it's got antecedents in the 19th century. But it becomes much more widespread in urban areas, especially in Berlin, where you have women, not necessarily dressing as and trying to pass as men, but just want the freedom to wear pants, to wear trousers, which horrified conservatives, right? These are women trying to be men, and this is going to upset our traditional conception of balanced gender roles, separate but equal spheres, right? Where women should be concentrating on having children and building a family unit. And if they're out in public, holding jobs, dressing like men, cutting their hair short, smoking, wearing lots of makeup, this is not what we want our women to be doing. And of course, the other fear, the other concern that's really driving a lot of these anxieties, which is again not specific to Germany, but Germany gets a lot of the attention, is a falling birth rate. Just happening everywhere in the industrialized world. It has to do with education, has to do with access to not so much to contraception, but to increased knowledge about avoiding pregnancy as a woman. A falling birth rate means that the future of your people might be in jeopardy because you're not producing enough to really sustain it, right? And if we give our women the freedom to decide whether or not they want to start families or to question their gender, where are we going to end up in 20, 30, 40 years? We're certainly not going to correct the current problem of a declining birth rate. Or so the thinking goes if you're a conservative German who's really worried about the future of your people in the aftermath of this devastating war that seemingly killed off an entire generation of young men.
And so you have this interesting kind of liberalization that is instigating the coming backlash.
Yes. There's that polarization, right?
Exactly.
The coming of the Republic, which is seen as this great political change that is surely going to affect power structures, not just politically, but also socially, actually doesn't change all that much. And those who suffered the most during the war will continue to suffer the most during the Weimar era, largely because they lack this deeper, more established cushion to fall back on that, the sort of industrialists, that class of people, or that the nobles with deep pockets might still have, that they can sort of still play with and depend on. And you see this really starkly in 1923, which was the height of hyperinflation in Germany. And this has a lot to do with the currency that was introduced and the new economic situation that the end of the war ushered in, and the tensions between Germany and France that played out in the Ruhr area of West Germany that led to a decision to embark on a general strike, which then exacerbated some really sort of horrific conditions already playing out, where German money essentially became worthless. And by November 1923, you can look this up or find images online. It was more cost effective to use bricks of paper money to light fires than it was to use that money to buy bread, because it was just so catastrophically out of control. So the savings of middle class and working class Germans who had just recovered maybe from the impact of World War I were wiped out. And then you see again that polarization between those who may or may not have felt that and those who feel increasingly like, by the way, by 23, they've had at least 4 changes of government. None of the politicians who are in charge of making decisions now seem to know what they're doing. They're not helping me. My voice is not being heard is perhaps the 2022 version of this, right? And so it'll take a little while still, but you see the extremist political parties appearing in the fringes. And they're still very fringe movements at this point, not really getting a lot of attention nationally, certainly. But they're there, and they're pulling on threads like the Treaty of Versailles was a terrible idea, and we'll get rid of it. The Republic is a bad idea; it's not doing anything, and we'll get rid of it. We've got ideas about how to do this. Those who are responsible for your current misery: Jews, Catholics. Catholics are never to be trusted; they're the minority Christian religion in Germany. Socialists, who by and large are part of every government at this point because they're the most stable political party, even with the communists having founded their own party. These are the 3 people that we should blame for the end of the war and for the current misery in the first part of the Weimar Republic. And they choose these groups also because going back to 1918 and the signing of the armistice, they had been representatives from the political parties that took power, which included the Socialists and the Center Party, which was a religious, Catholic religious political party. And there had been some very prominent German politicians who happened to be Jews that were also part of this. So those three will surface again and again in the rhetoric, especially of far right, what we would call far right, ultra right wing political parties like Nazis, but will point their fingers at these three sort of stereotypical enemies of Germany throughout this period.
It strikes me that because it's relevant to Ernst Lubitsch's experience as a Russian-German Jew.
Yeah.
During this time, it was both a time of great access to society for someone who was Jewish like Ernst. I mean, prior to World War II and earlier, his access and his kind of ancestors' access to civil society was very limited and legally. And during the Weimar era, it was in many ways more open than ever, which is part of what allowed him to become one of the most prominent artists of his generation in a very short amount of time. And yet there was a kind of growing violence to the anti-Semitism. I'm curious as to what an experience of someone who is Jewish as a part of society would have been in this period. Was the danger there presently for example, an average Jewish person living in Berlin? And I should also note that they were a tiny minority.
They were. Yes, they were. That's such a good question. And it's so hard to answer it succinctly and concisely. Yeah, we're in my seminar right now. We're going to spend basically two meetings discussing this. So 6 hours. But let's try and do it sort of in brief. Let's start with Jews in Germany after World War I. So by and large, Germany's Jewish population at this point is less than 1% of its total population. It's about 500,000. And the population is 60 million, somewhere in there. Most of the German Jewish community was highly assimilated. They spoke German and went to German schools and participated in German society fully, weren't particularly traditional looking in outward appearance, and identified as German as well as Jewish, but increasingly did not practice their religion. Some obviously there was still synagogue goers and Jews that would have had an identity based more in faith than not.
The amount of Jewish and Christian intermarriages was huge at this point.
Much bigger than it had been. Prior to World War I, religious communities tended to stay within their own communities. And this includes, in Germany anyways, Protestant Catholic intermarriage. There wasn't a lot of that at all. Like, it was heavily discouraged on both sides. And we're talking about the same sort of faith practice, right? Except that we're not in 1920s, 1910s, 1900s Germany. They were really distinct subcultures, and Catholics were understood to be, by the Protestants, to be problematic because their loyalty was ultimately to the Pope, who was over the mountains in Rome. So this is where we get the word ultramontane, which has this sort of sinister ring to it. Like, they're not real Germans because they can't be loyal ultimately to the state and to the idea of Germany. And Catholics, of course, looked at Protestants as this sort of heretical breakaway people who precisely didn't pay attention to the edicts coming out of Rome and from the true head of the church on earth. And so there was not a lot of compromise or attempt to sort of discuss or conciliate with each other. And Jews were even further removed, obviously. These were understood to be a people without a state. They lived in diaspora. They had rejected Christ, who came to save them. And so, these are the roots of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, right? They either should be forced to convert or not live among us, in hard times when the solution to tensions between the two communities broke down into violence. So what's happening in 1920s Berlin? German Jews participated in the war, served in the army, like all Germans did. German Jews tended to be more in urban spaces, were sort of more highly represented in certain populations. largely because of circumstances prior to their emancipation. There were only certain occupations they could hold, for instance, and this went back centuries, really. And this, of course, gave rise to conspiracies about Jewish worldwide plots to dominate Christians, right? Sort of what I would call standard anti-Semitic motifs, a lot of it fueled by this real hostility towards and fear of difference that's rooted in religion. Although by the 20th century, they're increasingly understood to be a racial group, right? There's something in their blood that makes them different. It's not simply a question of conversion anymore. But that's sort of creeping in slowly. We're not quite fully there. So somebody like Lubitsch wandering around in 1922 Berlin, I mean, there's a lot of violence, and some of it's aimed at Jewish politicians. Walter Rathenau, for instance, one of the most prominent examples of a politician who was assassinated. He was also Jewish for his role in the end of World War I. But Jews are not really singled out at this point, not even at the end of the 20s when you have much more common sort of Nazi-instigated violence. They're more likely to go after communists than they are after Jews. Now, it also happened that a lot of German communists were Jewish, but there were also a lot of German communists who were not Jewish. So while you pointed us towards violence that's bubbling up and being geared towards the Jewish community of Germany, I would actually say that doesn't really start in earnest until the 30s. The violence of the 20s and early 30s is much less coherent. It's a lot more spontaneous, and often it's more politically oriented than sort of racially oriented or motivated. And it's really who the Nazis are concerned with are not so much the racial enemy that their propaganda keeps talking about, that Hitler keeps harping on about, but it's the communists. And I mean, in Hitler's head, communists and Jews were synonymous. But realistically speaking, in the 1920s, the communist threat was much more something that Germans responded to and were scared of based on the example of Bolshevism. And they didn't necessarily equate that with Jews that they may or may not have known who lived down the street and ran the store on the corner kind of thing. So something we haven't really talked about is cinema during the Weimar era. I always take care to tell my students when we start on that topic, I usually show them Metropolis as sort of one of the best examples of Weimar era cinema.
Well, the kind of famous apocryphal story about Fritz Lang, where he was offered the job, the head of UFA, I believe, by Goebbels personally. This is all according to Lang, and then he left on the train the next night. But that's
exactly
probably partially apocryphal.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure.
But to me, it's very much a case of like, it's an ecstatic truth. It's a print the legend case.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
I think there's a deeper truth there about the urgency of German non-authoritarian filmmakers to leave.
Yeah. Well, because that's the other thing that happens with that, especially artists who were sensitive to political currents. You could see that coming if you paid attention to Nazism. And so Lubitsch leaves earlier, and I wouldn't say he's leaving because of the threat of Nazism, which in 1924, Hitler's in jail, the Nazi party's been disbanded, and it's really the pieces are scattered across Germany, even across the world, because Röhm leaves Europe entirely and goes to South America for a while. And from 24 to 28, you have this beautiful period of stability, largely due to Gustav Stresemann, who'd been chancellor very briefly and then became foreign minister. And he essentially settles the economy down after that period of hyperinflation, and he negotiates some very important alliances with some of Germany's neighbors and returns Germany to good standing in that community of European nation states. And all of a sudden, everything sort of starts to settle, at least in comparison to what came before and then what came next. And what comes next. So really what comes next is the Great Depression, which begins in the US, but is immediately and horrifically felt in Germany because of the Treaty of Versailles and the way that the reparations have been organized, that Germany must pay, but they're entirely dependent on American credit for that, which disappears overnight. And so once again, you have huge swaths of the German population in significant crisis for primarily economic reasons. And you have a parliament, a Reichstag, who again, like the Weimar Republic had 14 chancellors in 15 years. So there's absolutely no political stability. And by 1930, there's no faith that any of those parties can figure it out, because by 1930, they've had 11 years to figure this out, and they haven't yet. So Social Democrats, the center party politicians, the liberals, the conservatives, all of these recognizable parties with track records of failure aren't an option anymore. And so who gets the attention? It's the fringe parties, right? The formerly fringe parties, which are now just seen as the end of the spectrum parties. You have the communists on the left and the Nazis on the right. And nobody really likes the communists. Everybody's scared about what's going on in the Soviet Union now, in Bolshevik Soviet Union, where they seem to be killing people wantonly, and they've repressed religion entirely. And who knows what else is going on there. And then you've got the Nazis, and all they talk about are conservative values, kicking out the communists, killing them if necessary, and kicking out the Jews. And so as an artist, what are you going to take from that? And so you start to see this wave of emigration that begins really, I think, with artists who are the most sensitive to what the ramifications of that kind of message, even before the Nazis come to power, where it seems clear, I think, to really sort of far-sighted individuals that this is going to get worse before it can get better.
I think it's worth underlining, too, that it wasn't some coded thing, the anti-Semitism of the Nazi Party before they came into power. It was the text. And I think that often gets lost in the shuffle. It was a key part of their values. It's inseparable from that. It wasn't some incidental thing for a greater purpose or whatever. It was the end goal.
Yeah. No, Hitler's prison book text, what happens to you when you try your hand at revolution and you fail and you're thrown into jail. Well, you sit and you write your manifesto. He wasn't the only one who did this, but he's one of the most famous. And so Mein Kampf, My Struggle, is all about the Jew as existential threat to Germandom. And so the Nazis figure out, after their failed attempt at revolution in 1923, which they tried to overthrow the government in Munich, and they failed, and he ended up in jail, realized that we can't do this violently. We're going to have to do it through the system. And so we'll get elected. We'll get appointed the right way. And then we'll take the system apart from within. And that's exactly what they do. But they also figure out in 1930 that violent anti-Semitism is actually not going to get them any votes. It's not a draw to the German people. So they don't get rid of it. They just don't talk about it as much. And so that anti-Semitic rhetoric that was really present in the early 20s is toned down quite a bit for their return to the sort of national political scene in the early 30s. And once Hitler achieves that position of power, which he gets by, essentially winning the election of July 32 and forcing the conservative powers that be to work with the Nazi Party and getting appointed chancellor for January 33. That's when he sort of returns to form and starts to talk more about Jews as enemy. Although, again, he does it primarily in the first year or so in the language of anti-communism. And in fact, the communists are the first group that they attack in February of 33 in the wake of the Reichstag fire. So, but by then, I think Jews who were likely to leave Germany based on the perceived threat of Nazism, you needed the means to do so because anti-Semitism is not specific to Germany. And there were only so many places you could go as a Jew legally, especially if you didn't have money. And Canada wasn't one of them. Canada was not a destination that was letting in Jews. If you had the means and could leave, you probably left in that very early period. Jewish immigration out of Germany between 33 and 38, I would describe as kind of a trickle. Every now and then there's a bit of a burst, but there's not a lot. Like that 500,000 strong Jewish community doesn't vanish by 39. In fact, more than half of the community is still there when World War II breaks out.
Mm. And was that largely because of how difficult it became to leave?
Yeah. So it was always difficult for Jews to leave to try and find better circumstances for themselves. The majority of European Jews lived in 1919 either in Russia or in Poland. Poland had the biggest Jewish community of Europe at that time. and they tended to flee west. And so transited through Germany, didn't necessarily stay. And this is where I remember how I'd said when we started talking about Lubitsch, I described Germany's Jewish community as largely assimilated. Mm-hmm. Jews coming from Eastern Europe were not. They tended to be much more traditional, more orthodox, and so had distinct and obvious differences in culture, in language, and even physical appearance. They married well with Nazi anti-Semitism, Nazi anti-Semitic rhetoric, who tended to emphasize these differences, physical characteristics and behaviors that were, incompatible with Christian German ways of living. They were much more thinking about these Ostjuden, these East European Jews, than they were thinking about highly assimilated German Jews, right? Mm-hmm. They also tended to be much poorer, didn't have the means necessarily to go, beyond where they could walk. So the idea of getting onto a ship that would sail, to somewhere in the Americas was really out of reach for a lot of these Jewish families. And then by the later 1930s, the Nazis were only allowing Jews to leave if they could pay a tax. And so countries who perhaps had set quotas for Jewish immigrants prior to 1939 were far less likely to let in penniless Jews than they were to let in, Jews, period. Not much has changed, I would say, in the 21st century, where I think countries are still very reticent or very nervous about letting in refugees who don't have any money. We heard a lot of this sort of anxiety around the idea of letting in refugees from, war-torn areas of the Middle East. Are they going to bring our economy down? Are they going to be a drain? So this was a sort of language that was prevalent in the 1930s that circled around penniless Jews. Of course, Nazi Germany made them penniless by stripping them of their wealth. And really that sort of plunder, that opportunistic plunder, went hand in hand with discrimination and other forms of mistreatment. And then the war, when it broke out, made immigration basically impossible.
And it's actually for particularly, me being an amateur, but particularly, I think, compelling recounting of this is in Victor Klemperer's diaries, which was one of the most powerful texts I've ever read about this. And it's interesting, as a little sidebar, that when Lubitsch moved to America, he was actually the subject of a significant, I would say, icy reception, in that there was even organized demonstrations against him when he landed, not because he was Jewish, but because he was German. They didn't want this basically, big name German director coming in largely grudges from World War I.
Exactly. Germans were the enemy. You wonder if the other German emigres had similar experiences when they first came over and how they navigated that even during World War II. Because I remember, Marlene Dietrich, who's another very famous example of a German artist who fled. Actually, she fled the Nazis. I think she left in 1930, and not because she was Jewish, because she just refused to live in that kind of a society. She was very present for American soldiers during World War II. Like, she supported them by going out and putting on shows for them. And I wonder if she got any flack for being German herself. It's interesting how common that was among even just in the film industry, like people like Sig Rumen, who actually, he was another German immigrant. He was an actor, acted in, I believe, 3 or 4 Lubitsch films. He did active, wartime work on behalf of the Americans. Yeah. And you had other German directors making, or informally German directors, in terms of citizenship, making propaganda films. That's right. For the Americans. That's so right. I think Lubitsch in some ways broke some seals on that, because you had this. You have people like Murnau, Long, von Sternberg. Von Sternberg, yeah. Peter Lorre. Billy Wilder. Yep. Was another big name who came at this time. Became Lubitsch's kind of one of his 2 key disciples. Exactly. Him and Otto Preminger, another one. Yeah, no, it's a veritable who's who. Like, if you go through prominent Hollywood directors and actors in the late 30s and early 40s, it's kind of astonishing, really, the proportion that came out of Central Europe, shall we say. This all is of particular interest, I think, to listeners of this podcast. Hello. Because
so much of Lubitsch's work made within Germany and later in the US is informed by this experience. Not only the obvious film like 1942's To Be or Not to Be, but films like Clooney Brown, which is partially about the immigrant experience, at least in the very last scene. Films like Ninotchka, Lubitsch's ideas of kind of, human connection transcend international politics, and also the way that he glommed onto basically American-style capitalism so fully. He felt completely at home in that system in a way that he never did. And he famously said, I prefer the Paris in the Paramount Law to the real Paris, because almost all of his films were set in Europe. And a lot of them in this romanticized pre-war or interwar era. Ninotchka starts with a title card that explicitly states that, yes, this film happened before 1939. So much of his attitudes towards, even geopolitics to culture are so rooted in this experience that he had in wartime and interwar Germany.
Germany obviously had capitalist structures. It was a capitalist economy that wasn't nearly as powerful as the American economy for various reasons, although it certainly tried very hard. But there was something about American culture, I think, that once that initial icy reception wore off, my sense was that most artists, in any case, found ways to make homes for themselves.
Oh yes,
fairly comfortably. Intellectuals, maybe not so much. I can think of academics, German Jewish academics who came to the United States. And it really was temporary and always understood to be temporary. Theodor Adorno is the most prominent example, who was one of the founders of the Frankfurt School, and he went back to Germany when he could. Brecht might be the one anomaly because he doesn't stay in the U.S., right?
No,
he comes over, and Brecht was Jewish, but he was also very communist. Like he was very, very socialist minded, and so that American system, I don't think he found a home in it, and so he goes back to not just to Germany but to East Germany, right?
Oh, interesting. Yeah,
when he can.
Yeah, it's interesting. You hear kind of accounts from people like Billy Wilder and even Groucho Marx of a sort of a disillusionment with post-war Germany.
Yeah.
Marx famously danced on Hitler's grave and then never came back. That's the story. I'm not sure how true that is, but. You said something that provoked something in my head that I want to touch upon in regards to Lubitsch. With Lubitsch especially, in 1923-24, he's given an icy reception. And by 1934, he's the head of Paramount.
Right.
He's the only director, I believe, in Hollywood history to ever actually head up a studio for only a couple of years. It wasn't a great marriage, but that 10 years, it's as astronomical as any rise of any artist in American
That's impressive.
Film.
Yeah.
Is there any stone that we haven't turned yet that we should turn, I wonder?
Perhaps only to add that our understanding of the Weimar Republic as this era of cultural, almost frenetic activity, like feverish output, in some ways is colored by what came after, because the Nazis shut so much of it down so quickly. I almost compare it to this like myths of like the partying on the Titanic as it was sinking or something, this idea of this, everyone knows that they're doomed and it's gonna, might as well party while we can. Exactly. And so not to detract from what it was. And obviously there was so much of that was real. Just a sort of cautionary note that perhaps it looks brighter in hindsight, knowing the dark chapters that shut it down, if temporarily. And the example I used for my students is the new woman. She was called the new woman. This stereotype, this archetype of this dangerous sort of young woman who defied gender norms. To what extent did she really exist? There was so much anxiety around her that we want to, I think, as students, believe that all young German women were drawn to this model and wanted to be this model. And I'm not sure actually that she was as present or as ubiquitous as perhaps we would like to think. Like, we want all young women to be defying sort of conservative norms and finding space to create their own identities. And in reality, I don't think a lot of young German women were actually doing that. It was more the idea that they could that's important, and that precisely the Nazis take away, because they return Germany to sort of very rigid understandings of gender norms, and really not much straying from that. Even if they did, homosexuality continued to be criminalized, but they really turned the other way when members of their own movement engaged in that sort of activity or held to that kind of identity. And really, there were an awful lot of active gay men in the Third Reich that we don't know much about, that the Nazis kind of, 50,000 gay men ended up in concentration camps, and I think 5,000 were convicted and sort of held for longer terms. But there were far more than that were just kind of left alone, as long as you're not parading yourself down, Unter den Linden in Berlin the way you could have during the Weimar Republic. So there's, I don't know, a sort of, in closing, a desire to remember that the Weimar era, glows brightly because the Third Reich was so dark.
It's not often that we have such a contrast, like an obvious, famous, inviting comparison contrast where you can go, oh, that's the way it was overnight, seemingly. That's the way it is now.
Yeah, it's almost dizzying, especially for the Germans who were involved, right?
I would be remiss not to mention, there are two books sitting on the table that we are sharing right now that you brought. And I'd like you to introduce both, because one of them was actually a major source for my research for this podcast. And I was relieved to see it, because I was like, oh, am I going to make an ass of myself with this, like a pop history book? But I'd like you to introduce both of the books.
Sure. So one is called Weimar Germany, Promise and Tragedy, by historian Erich D. Weitz. And it's my go-to text for teaching the history of the Weimar Republic, but especially for its focus on the arts, on society and culture. So there is a chronological narrative about the political history of the Republic, but Weitz really his intentions are to highlight the evolution of various movements and products in artistic and social societal spheres. So there's a great deal about architecture, and there's there's entire chapters on the incipient film industry in Germany. There's an entire chapter on sex and bodies, right? And sort of the medical aspect and the political fights around things like contraception and abortion. So it's big and somewhat scary for that reason.
It's a few inches thick. Yeah.
It is. But it's very readable. My students have said I paired it with another book that was half the size and much denser and less enjoyable. So they really like this one. The bigger, heavier book, I should say, is MoMA's exhibition catalog for German Expressionism, the Graphic Impulse, which I think was, I'm going to date myself. I think it was 20 years ago that they held it.
And just to interject myself, MoMA it stands for Museum of Modern Art in New York.
In New York. Sorry, I should have made that clear. But it's like my Bible of the movement, German Expressionism, which in fact starts at the end of the 19th century, but really sort of comes into its own and does all sorts of interesting, divergent, radical, unexpected, exciting things during the Weimar Republic. And it shoots off into surrealism, and then it has important ties to the new objectivity, die neue Sachlichkeit, and into Bauhaus and things like that. And so just for the images alone, because historians too get tired of text and don't mind looking at pictures, I bring it to show my students, like, if you want a visual understanding of what the Weimar Republic was, it's a really good place to start. But actually, there's a third book I didn't bring that I should have, that I really want to highlight to you and to your readers. And it's a slender book called What I Saw by Joseph Roth, or if you want me to anglicize it, Joseph Roth. And Roth was an Austrian-born Jew who emigrated to Germany and ended up in Berlin during the war, and I think the first couple of years of the post-war period, 1919, 1920. And then he sort of flits around Western Europe, doesn't really stay in Berlin, but returns on occasion. But he was a journalist. He wrote for a number of German newspapers. What I Saw is a collection of his reports from the capital city during the Weimar Republic. And it covers everything from the construction of infrastructure to theater, to neighborhoods in Berlin, to the impressions that Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe make. And it is so colorful. There are no photos, there are no images. The ideas you get about what Weimar era Berlin was are so poignantly and painstakingly rendered. And it's just so subjective. It's one person's impression of a capital city in a time of great flux. Like, what's there not to like about that? You don't have to agree with everything, but man, he had his opinions and he shared them sort of quite willingly. So I highly recommend that.
Oh, that's wonderful. As far as one book I've been referring to occasionally is Richard Evans's Coming of the Third Reich, which is a narrative history of Germany. It's mostly between 1840-ish. It starts with, he has the question about starting with Bismarck, but he really does start with kind of Napoleon, and it goes all the way up to February 1933. Yeah. I found it powerful in the mental exercises that Evans throws in. And these are they're not literal exercises. They're kind of embedded in the text to kind of encourage you to see history in a different way than you had before.
Yes.
So one particularly memorable passage was when he invites you, the reader, to consider how if you were, to time travel to turn of the 20th century and ask someone out of the Western European, kind of the, what you might call, culturally sophisticated, in big air quotes, countries, which would descend by mid-century into, a menagerie of violence. A sufficiently educated person might have picked France.
Yes.
And that's just one example of many, but there are so many moments like that in that book where I genuinely, it completely changed how I saw the causal relationships in history. So I want to recommend that book on that level. Yeah. And I mean, to any academics listening to this, it's probably of limited use, but someone like me who read it 6 years ago and was a novice, it opened so many doors for me. Thank you so much, Lauren, for taking part in this. It's been an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for making the time for, an amateur like me to waltz in and ask you questions.
Yeah, no, it was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Next week, Where is My Treasure? Also known as When I Was Dead, with Willa Ross. Head over to www.ernstcast.com for the links to the various public domain films we'll be discussing this season and other resources such as show notes. How Would Lubitsch Do It is a production of Moving Image Agency. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review us on whatever podcast service you happen to use. We'd like to acknowledge that this podcast was produced on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples.